bring data first. Thank you so much for your answer for this polling. Okay, right. Now moving along to our session, please welcome Andrew, who will be speaking to us on research data services by information professionals. Hello, Andrew. Good morning. Can you unmute your audio, please?
Sorry, I was just a slight technical glitch there. Apologies.
Okay, right. Okay, before he gives the presentation that we've been waiting for, let me give you some information background about Andrew. Andrew is a senior lecturer at the Information School at the University of Sheffield. And he's a postgraduate research coordinator. And at the MSc in Digital Library Management program, he has several research interests around use of practice theory to explore social media use, virtual communities, and communities of practice, and study of library-related technologies and their effects on library organization, especially the RDM. And the third one, the development of the information profession. Okay, and he's also the director of learning and teaching for the Information School. And Andrew also an author of the book called Exploring Research Data Management, which he wrote together with Eddie Verban. This is the book. Hopefully you can see the book through the screen. Okay, this book is very recommended for all of you, librarian or academician and student who wants to learn more about the RDM. Okay, without further ado, please welcome Andrew. Andrew, time and screens are yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. And of course, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I hope it will prove useful to everyone. I'm from the Information School in the University of Sheffield in the UK. It's one of the, we like to think of ourselves as one of the leading places to study information studies in the world. What am I going to talk about in this talk today? I've sort of divided it up into the talk into these 8 sections. I know many of you may have come to Armin Strauber's talk a few weeks ago, so there's some overlap with what he said, but I hopefully by starting from the basics, we'll all be on the same, kind of share a common understanding of what the issues are. So I'm going to say a little bit about, first of all, a bit about, well, what is research data? What's it like? I think that's important to start with that fundamental. A bit about the background of why this topic has become important in the last few years, which Armin did talk quite a lot about, so I'm not going to dwell so much on that. But I'm going to say something about whether the view of open science that is promoted by countries like the UK is necessarily appropriate to in all contexts. So that's an important thing. But I'm also going to talk about what's challenging about managing data. This isn't an easy area to do things. You're trying to really change the culture of researchers, and research cultures are very diverse and very different. So it's a very challenging area. You can do some really good things, but we need to really acknowledge that it's not going to be easy to just change people's ways of doing things that are quite embedded. I'm going to talk a bit about how to find out what you need for your library or your institution in terms of research data service, how we're going to find out. something about having a policy, an institutional policy. Then we're going to look at, well, what are the services that we could deliver? And then something about the skills we need to work in this area. And this links into what, as educators, if some of you are LIS educators, what we need to know to be teaching our students. And finally, a little bit of a kind of Q&A at the end. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do. And I wanted to keep things moving fairly fast and for it not to be just me talking. So I'm going to pause quite a lot and ask for questions. So I'm going to have those 8 sections. I'm going to pause after each one, and hopefully you can stop me and ask questions all along. And you can also just type into the chat. And I think the slides should be available to you already, so you can see what we're going to cover. There's no sort of like mystery there. So that's what I'm planning to do, and I hope that that's going to be useful to you. So the first section is about, well, what is research data and what's it like? And I thought, might as well prompt you to maybe type into the chat or the Q&A just your thoughts of what you think research data is, what examples you can think of. So I'll just give you a few moments if you want to type into the chat anything about what you think are the key forms of data. That would be quite interesting to see what you're thinking. So please do. If you've got any thoughts about, well, what do you think research data is, maybe just type into the chat any of your thoughts about what data are. And maybe Harry can sort of read anything out that is typed in there.
So there are some answers already on the chat rooms.
Brilliant. Do you want to read a few out? That'd be good.
Okay. The first one, raw materials, and then survey result, digital data, audio and video, spatial data, socioeconomics data, streaming data, tweet and other social media data, recording interview, questionnaire of research spatial data. Again, okay. Any other answer? Code?
Yeah, that's really good. That's revealing something really important. We've got lots of different types of data there of very different qualities. And I mean, on my slide, I've got some of the things you put and maybe a few others. It could be, I think the main point to take away from this is that data is very various. It's very diverse. As librarians, we're often, for example, in institutional repositories managing publications, but they're mostly PDFs or maybe documents. They're kind of fairly standard in their format. But research data is very various. Almost anything that somebody analyzes could be data. It could be a physical object, obviously. And it's all those things you listed, like questionnaire data, data from, it could be code, as somebody wrote. It could be outputs from a computer simulation. It could be moving images. It could be photographs. It could be different types of computing imagery. So with this diversity, obviously, there carries a complexity in terms of, for example, we're very used to doing descriptions as librarians of material like articles, journal articles and books. That's what we do a lot of the time. But by definition, with this quite diverse body of material, we've got to think in terms of different schema for description, different metadata schema. So it's not going to be simple, and the size of some of these things, like moving images, tend to be very large files. Others can be very simple text documents. So there's a difference in terms of the size of and scale of data. So this kind of reveals to us that we're dealing with something pretty complex, and we've got to take on board that data is quite diverse. The next two slides I won't talk too much about. They're really just formal definitions. And the reason why you might want a formal definition is, for example, many researchers wouldn't even really think of themselves as collecting data as part of their research, yet they do. For example, if we go to here on the third point here is that researchers call data something else. They call them primary sources. Historians do collect data, but they call them sources. So we haven't got a common language about research data either. People call it different things. And on this slide, we've got the variety of research data. We've got the volume. In certain fields like astronomy, we think of in certain scientific fields, the amount of data that's being produced is truly colossal. So there's again an issue of scale. So we're interested in, perhaps used to running a repository for the outputs of research, like articles, but they're all just about the same size, these things. They're not colossal scale. We've got to think in terms of, if we're running a data repository, we've got to kind of manage the scale of this, the variety, the different metadata standards. We've also got to talk to researchers in their own language about what data really is to them. Then on my fourth bullet, it's like ownership is not clear. For many researchers, as that lovely video at the beginning of the session suggested, like, data is very important to the researchers, something that collecting data is a very important process, a kind of rite of passage to becoming a true researcher, to go and collect your own data. So they have a sense of ownership over that data. And yet also we could say that institutions and funders believe they also own data. And digital data is fragile. We might think of the way that something that's printed out decays, but digital data is even more fragile than print material, because if you haven't got the right metadata and documentation to explain what the data is and how it was collected, essentially it's meaningless. So we need to think about, we can't just collect data and it has a meaning in itself. It has to have the metadata that explains how it's collected. And finally, my last point on the page there is data is pretty complex. Often, for example, as a qualitative researcher myself, I do interviews and then I transcribe that interview. I've also got a recording. Then I have an analyzed version of that data. There's multiple versions of that one piece of data, so it's not clear what the data is at the time. So all this is pointing to the importance of really thinking about what research data is, what it looks like in different contexts. Different disciplines have different types of data, and we have to really get to grips with that. And I think something that I would urge you to do if you're a librarian, or particularly, and you're getting into this area, it's like talk to some researchers, like a PhD student, about their research and find out about what their data is and what it looks like and what the processes are around its creation. That will really give you an insight into the value attached to data and the ways it's created and how it's valued. So we've always, when we've ever given advice and training to information professionals is like go and talk to researchers. They love talking about their research. Just find out what they think data is, and it will really help you grasp what the issues might be for them. So that's I thought I'd start with that to just talk about a bit about what is research data. We're going to talk a lot about it today, but we need to know what it really is. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions so far. So if Harry could pick up any questions, because it's hard for me to see the Q&A, but if you've got any questions at this point, it could give you a break from me just talking. Let's just pause a moment and see if there are any questions.
Okay, there are an attendee, Mr. Fuad Ghani, who wants to ask you directly. So, Reni, could you unmute Mr. Fuad Ghani in order to ask directly to Andrew?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
We can hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you much. I would like to ask you concerning about what is the basic principle differences between data, information, and knowledge. Sometimes we can get confusion regarding about that and how people think when talk about data actually. Mr. Andrew.
Ooh, that's a very good question. What's the difference between data, information, and knowledge? I think in the context we're talking about, for most researchers, I think we have to say that research data is diverse, and how it's used to construct knowledge is different in different disciplines. So a historian kind of reads various original documents and combs through them and kind of decides on a conclusion. If you've got survey results, you analyze them using SPSS or some tool like that and apply statistical tests. The way that data is the kind of raw stuff that we're going to analyze to kind of come to some conclusions. But in different types of research, it's used in different ways. If you're analyzing a questionnaire, it's more of a hypothesis-driven approach. It's a more deductive approach. In history, it'd be more qualitative, it's more inductive. So I guess for me, the difference between data, information, and knowledge, to partially answer your question, is that when we talk about research data, it's the kind of the raw stuff collected in the field that I'm going to use to build knowledge. But how that happens might be very different in different disciplines. You convinced? Is that a good answer, or do you think there's more to say about that? It's an interesting question.
Yes, basically we get kinds of highlight regarding about information, because sometimes the use is very interchanged. Some people say that actually data, information are the same thing. In fact, sometimes it's quite different. For example, for the capitalist people, they talk about only information, not data and knowledge. But in fact, we also against the so-called information society and knowledge society, part of United Nations policy regarding about that. So sometimes people get confused regarding about that term actually in reality.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And it applies very much in the practice of research data management, that if I go and talk to someone about their data, as I've said already, they may say, well, I don't really collect data. They may refer to it as something else. They might refer to it as information, or often like a source. So the language around research data and data, information, and knowledge is unclear. So I think that's really why in that first bit of advice is like, go and talk to people. And if you're supporting researchers in a particular area, you've got to learn their language, the language they use to talk about their work. So I think it's a really good point. Yeah,
Thank you.
these terms are quite unclear.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Thank you, Mr. Fuad Ghani. Is there any
Yes.
other questions? Or you can continue your presentation first, Andrew.
Okay, thanks for this question. So I know that Armin Straube, when he came a few weeks ago, he did talk about quite a lot about this policy context in which RDM became important. So I'm not going to talk at great length about this, but I just want to say there's a number of kind of drivers behind this agenda that suddenly in maybe the last 10 years, research data management has become a thing that people think is important. So one reason is the data deluge, the amount of data that's being created in things like astronomy projects. It was realized that governments are investing a huge amount of money in this data to create it, and therefore it must be a focus on reusing it. It can't be just a once and for all thing. So there's been no decline in this kind of focus on big data. We're increasingly hearing kind of a lot of discussion around artificial intelligence, but that actually is premised on big data. So I think this issue of like, there's a lot of data out there is, and we're becoming a more of a datafied society. Lots of people are talking about the process of datafication, that we, in our everyday lives, we're creating lots of data about ourselves. This is increasingly critical to organizations. And so it must be also critical to research to kind of look after that. So that's one thing that's going on. And that probably lies in itself behind this growing, my second bullet point there really is about the growing importance to governments and funders to say that data should be looked after. And the kind of founding document is probably the OECD principles. And the most recent perhaps is the UNESCO recommendation on open science in 2020. Then in particular disciplines, down here on the crisis of replication, there's certain disciplines where it's been realized that classic experiments that are kind of the foundation of thinking, such as in psychology, cannot be reproduced. And there's some question about how do we make sure that science builds on firm foundations of what we already know. So there's a need in certain subjects to reproduce the results from earlier work, and there's a sense of crisis around that sometimes in psychology and biomedicine in particular, there's kind of challenges around that. The open research movement, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, has been a big driver for this agenda, but it's also things like in Europe, we've got this legislation around privacy called GDPR, information security and confidentiality. Those are big drivers for managing data more carefully. And finally on my list is journal mandates. So publishers in journals are increasingly telling researchers that if you want to publish your work, you've also got to share the data on which it's based. So we've got a lot of things going on there that maybe they push in one direction to some extent, but they also pull in slightly different directions at times. So we've got quite a complex agenda going on. I'm not going to go through some of these slides, so this is just a bit about the UNESCO recommendation on open science. The concept of open science is quite a complicated one, so this slide is just talking about different ideas about what open science might mean. I know also Armin Straube talked quite a lot about FAIR, so I'm not going to go over that, but these are kind of, in countries like the UK, there's a lot of kind of political momentum around saying the research data should be shared on FAIR principles. And if you want to find out more about that, you can kind of test yourself of the awareness of FAIR using this rather nice little website that I've linked to there. But I wanted to make a slightly different point, and that is also that there is a lot of increasing understanding that for example, the FAIR principles fall short to me of being applicable in every context. So I don't think we should assume that how open science has been advocated in countries like the UK necessarily applies in every country. For example, I'm very struck by the work of Bezuidenhout, who's been looking at scholars, say, in Africa, and those struggles they have to make the best use of open data. It's not a level playing field, and in some ways, the idea of open research is more advantageous to certain types of scholars than for others. And we know that the global publishing system is already controlled essentially by global north economic interests and research agendas. So we know that, for example, the agenda for research in Africa is often driven by the needs of the global north rather than of Africa. So I think it's really important to say that for Indonesia, for the Indonesian context, I think you have to think about, well, what does openness mean? How is it going to be defined locally that is going to benefit Indonesia and Indonesian researchers? And we shouldn't just assume that the model developed in the global north can apply very easily to other countries. So I think it's worth, I can't comment in depth on that. I'm not an expert on the Indonesian scene, but I think it's something worth discussing. But I thought, just pause there, I've been talking too much, maybe give you a chance again to give your opinion. So we've got another poll, and you can see popping up on your screen now, and it's asking you, what do you think, pick one of these drivers. Do you think it's the amount of data that's out there, the rise of the idea of big data? Is it this ideal of open research and open science? Is that the key driver in your mind? Or is it really that the funders of research are saying, you've got to share data? Or is it the publishers, is it the journal publishers, is that really going to be the key driver? Or is it the direct benefits to researchers themselves? Do you think that is what will make, is really important to emphasize in this area of research data management? So we're just asking you to vote on that. And it'd be very interesting to see what the results are of that little poll. What do you think is the most important driver? Maybe I could ask Ari to read out some of the results.
Okay. For the first questions, what do you think is the most important driver for RDM? 67% are answering that direct benefits to researcher of good data management, followed by the ideal of open research equal to funders managing data sharing, and then journals managing data publication, and the rise of big data.
That's a really interesting result, and I must admit, I don't think there's a correct answer to this, but I do think this issue of the direct benefits to researchers is something that we really need to focus on. For example, if I, as a librarian, trying to promote the benefits of thinking about research data management, I've really got to think of what are the benefits to that specific researcher of managing their data better. And that might not be about sharing data. It might be much more about looking after it as you collect it, things like that. So I think I'm going to say I fall into I think I clicked on direct benefits as well. So it's not to say the other things aren't important, they are important. So let's just think about what this challenge of managing research data is about. So this slide, I think, is really important to me. It's not that I don't think data should be shared. I think it should be in many, many cases. There are many reasons researchers will give that they can't share data. they're worried. So the first bullet point, they're worried that they're going to spend a lot of time creating the data, but then somebody else is going to analyze it and publish before them. There are many, the second bullet, there are many, if you're working with a commercial company, for example, they want the results to be confidential. You can't necessarily share it. There are ethical reasons why you might not share it, because you don't want to expose your participants to any risk to their privacy and confidentiality. There's also the sheer way that RDM can take up time. It's doing more work. Researchers are busy, they're under pressure to publish in the best publications and so forth. They don't have time to create metadata and documentation about their data, and they often don't have the skills or confidence. They don't know where should I put my data? Where's the best place to share? Well, I know in Indonesia you've developed, a national repository, but do you have the skills? Do you feel confident about how to create metadata about your data? And then a lot of qualitative researchers will say, well, my research is very, very specific. I don't know that anyone is really going to reuse my data. It's not. Is it really that useful? Is it really feasible for someone else to reuse my data? Because they don't really know how it was collected. And then there's a lack of a reuse culture, in the sense that, say in my field where I do research, I don't think I've ever seen someone publish a paper that's based on reanalyzing data. So there's a kind of a barrier there to me sharing my data, because I don't see that other people would use it. So there's many arguments around that researchers will have. They're kind of worries in the back of the researcher's mind. And I think as people who are trying to support researchers to share their data, to manage their data better, we need to kind of work in this area and think about how we can kind of address some of these concerns. So I think it's really important to acknowledge this isn't going to be an easy task where everyone's going to run up and say, oh, great, you want to help me look after my data, my research data. I think people will be quite resistant. That has been the experience in places like the UK. So we've got to do quite a lot of work there. And this force field analysis kind of mapping that I've produced hopefully should help you think about this. So I've put here the drivers for good data management and open scholarship and open research. But we know there's often some barriers too. And something that you might want to do at a later point, is to, in your own context, think about how big these arrows should be. Because in force field analysis, what we do is we redraw the arrows to indicate their strength. I've got a slide in a moment. Yeah, this is my sort of redrawing of it. I think some arrows are really, really big and some are quite small. But I think it's something I would encourage you to just go back. This is something you could do later, is look at that diagram and redraw it. And it might be something you could redraw for every researcher you talk to, because in every case there's a set of barriers at work that are really motivating. For some researchers, funder compliance is the key driver. But there's another key barrier, and we have to really understand what the issues are for researchers we're particularly talking to. I think I won't go through those slides, but I just, again, just talk quite a lot, pause there, and I'd be very interested to hear if you've got any sort of questions you want to ask at that point, or your thoughts before we move on to more, how we're going to build these research data services. So I don't.
There are 3 questions already.
Okay.
Do records, information, and data have something in common? What do they have in common, actually? The question is from Raisti Warpratama. I think it's still related to the first question.
Yeah, okay. What's the relationship between data and information and knowledge? Well, I think I believe I've kind of given the best answer I can. I think it's a very interesting kind of philosophical question that we should, if we're working in the library and information science field, think about. I think in this particular area of research data management, I think data is the raw material from which ultimately knowledge is created. But as I said, I don't think we can generalize about how that happens because different disciplines use data in different ways. They have a different relation to data. Sometimes data is created with a hypothesis in mind. It's a very deductive way of looking at the relationship between data and knowledge. And it's, in other cases, it's much more inductive. It's much more data is something you explore to create knowledge. So perhaps that isn't a very good answer. And I feel I'm repeating what I said before, but hopefully that's a little bit useful. It's a very interesting question.
Okay, right. Next question from Ludia Arika. How ethics and intellectual property will be addressed in RDM?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So the slightly separate is regards ethics. There's definitely, in any area where the research is about humans and the data is collected from people, there's a massive ethical issue of we need the consent of participants of how we're going to use their data. In particular, if we want to share data, we've got to get agreement from participants that happens. So, and this is a key logic, I think, that we need to, at the beginning of a research process, when we're asking for ethics to collect data, know that at the end we want to share data. And it's a general principle of research data management is you've got to think about it from the beginning of research. It's no good getting to the end of the project and thinking, oh, it would be nice to share the data. It's way too late to be thinking like that. So ethics and RDM are tightly linked, at least in human studies. Of course, there's other dimensions to the ethics. For example, to me, there is an ethical issue around if I get public money to do research, I should share the data. That's a kind of ethical emphasis for me. Intellectual property rights, again, is like probably a key issue in terms of we've got to be clear. Sometimes the data we collect we collect it, but is actually still owned by people who create it. So if I'm doing a study of photo sharing on a website, I think the people who created the photos still own that data. So I can't just share it. I've got to work out negotiate something about intellectual property rights there. Equally, at the end of the process, if I created data through interviews or questionnaires or something, there is a licensing issue at the end. And I think the general opinion is we should move towards, Creative Commons type licenses, share alike kind of licenses where people can use the data in the way that they want. But there is the possibility of controlling licenses about research data so that we share data, but on the basis of it being used in particular types of ways. So thinking about how to license the data you're sharing is a kind of key issue.
Okay, it's quite debatable also, especially for data like social media data, like tweets. How can we get the consent from the participants. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
quite interesting.
yeah, that's a very good point.
Okay. Right. Other questions from Reni. How you redraw them from open scholarship and then open data sharing, and good data management. And do you have real example of rewards for data sharing?
Could you, sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Could you just repeat it?
Okay, I think it's related to your previous slide.
Actually, it's the second questions.
Okay. Or do you want to ask directly to Andrew?
Yeah, from your previous slide, you mentioned that we have the rewards for data sharing. Do you have like a real example in the UK or EU for giving rewards?
Ah, right, yes, yes. Yes, I mean, that is a very good question, actually. So the University of Sheffield has just set up kind of an award for open scholarship. So any researcher who's done something particularly exciting in terms of sharing data can win a prize. And of course, that would be accompanied by kind of quite a lot of reputational benefit to them. So that could be one way of rewarding being open. It's quite an open-ended way of doing it. It could be more built into appraisal systems in theory, that you could say, well, in my department, we're going to, when you get your annual appraisal as a researcher, that you've got to show some commitment to open scholarship as appropriate to your discipline. Of course, the challenge is that what openness means for different disciplines is a bit different. Some subject areas, open sharing of data has gone on for years. In some areas, it's very, very new. So you'd have to judge contributions in terms of disciplinary kind of maturity and openness. But it's a good question. Yeah, I think it's like thinking, how can institutions reward people for participating in this area?
Okay, next question from Dwi Untari from LIPI. Is data sharing influenced by the nature or maybe the culture of some disciplines like computer science, medical science, and other health science or linguistics? Generally, the researchers from those disciplines are easily share their data, and they want to share their data compared to other disciplines.
Yeah, I think the question uses the word culture. So I definitely think different disciplines have their own culture. As you mentioned, computer science or maybe health science. Computer science, it's very common for people to share certain types of things like code. You've got websites like GitHub where people regularly, there's a lot of commitment to the idea of open source. So in that area, but remember, computer science itself is made up of lots of different communities and the practices might be a little bit different. If you jump over to, say, a humanities discipline like history, it's a very, very different way of doing research. There's a very different, the data itself is different. Attitudes to sharing data is probably very different. So I think that you've hit the nail on the head really with we need to look at different cultures of doing research. And that's why I said, go and talk to researchers. So if say you're a librarian working in health sciences, go and talk to different researchers in different in different disciplinary areas and just chat to them about what their data is. Do they already share data? There's no point in advocating data sharing when they're already doing it. In other areas, they might be very resistant. So it's about talking to people, I think, and gauging what the culture is like. And then because it's about culture, we know that changing culture is very hard. It's not going to be easy to shift disciplinary cultures. So we have to really think about what the arguments are that work for a particular group. So again, a very, very good question. I think it's like, I think part of when we talk about research data services, we've got to think in terms of, we do trying to change cultures.
Right. That's the last question. So please continue your presentation.
Okay, brilliant. So pressing on, one of the things I want to say is, going back to my idea that I think you have to work out for every institution needs maybe to think through what its requirements are. And one of the, how do we find out what the needs for research data services are? So the obvious ways are interviews and a survey. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about a survey, because I think sending out a survey to people in your institution to see, well, what are they already doing? What sort of data are they gathering? Are they aware of the policy? Are they aware of the national repository? Do they already share data? Doing a survey can really give you that information that you need to design the most appropriate services. It can also help you identify people who are already really doing a fantastic job. And actually, as we were talking about this kind of idea of changing cultures, if you can find people who are already kind of pathfinders, already doing a great job of doing open science, say, they can be really good allies. You can also identify problem areas. So it's going to help you really understand what the situation is in your institution. And it's also something you can go to senior managers in the university and say, well, there's a problem here, or there's a possibility, an opportunity here. It gives you some data to persuade them. When we did the surveys at Sheffield, it was a really useful source, because you might think senior research managers know what's going on in terms of, say, managing data, keeping it secure, sharing data, but they probably don't. Research leaders have a kind of overall picture, but it's not something, the position about research data may be that they don't know too much. So actually, it's really useful advocacy material to do a survey to find out what your institution needs. So maybe pause a moment there, and if you want to type into the chat, what questions would you put in a survey? What do you think is the key question you want to know about from researchers? What would you ask them in your survey? Just to give you a chance to sort of think about that, rather than me just tell you the answer of what I think. What do you really want to know about what researchers are doing now, thinking now? What would you ask them in a survey? And again, if Ari could pick up any answers, because I can't.
Okay, there are some answers.
Great.
Okay, where do you store the data?
Yeah.
And do you use online data repository?
Yeah.
That's the two questions for the survey coming from Reni.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of questions you want to be asking. I've got here's some of them. You know, what types of data being collected and used? How much data? I mean, when we did the survey at Sheffield, there were some pockets of people who were collecting vast amounts of data, and that was kind of really interesting to our IT services. So how much data is being created? Who do they think owns the data? Are they aware of the local policy? Have they already sharing data? Where are they sharing data? Are they willing to share data? These are all the kinds of questions you can ask. And where do they want training? So and a little bit about, obviously, about the person who's completing the questionnaire to sort of to work out whether there's differences between, say, PhD students, what they want, and senior researchers, or again, between different departments, what are their needs.
Yeah, there's another interesting question from Mr. Wardiono. How long do you gonna keep your data?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. That would be very helpful to know if people are going to want to keep it forever, for example, or are they just going to keep it to the end of the project? Is that what they're committed to doing? That would have a big impact on whether they can share their data or what their plans are. So the good news is that a few years ago, in the UK, a kind of toolkit was developed of questions, and then that was updated. And if you go to this URL I put up on the screen, you can find just every possible question you could think of that you might want to use. And I think that's a really good resource for like building your own questionnaire. Because there's so many questions you might ask, you can't ask them all probably. And we did a survey at Sheffield, and I think there's some kind of reflections on the results of that in this paper. But so, and I'm not going to go through these slides, but these are just like some of the results that we had. You can look at them later about what people wanted. But I think I'll maybe pause there to see if there's other questions about, how do we find out what my institution needs in terms of the service? How do we promote a questionnaire? If there's any questions about.
There's an attendee who wants to ask you questions. Okay, Mr. Fuad Ghani. The co-host, could you please help me to unmute Mr. Fuad Ghani?
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to also to see it from your previous slide regarding about some kinds of issue about the politics of open information in Indonesia and the availability of Indonesian language and Scopus, for example, and also regarding about the data commodification and also the politics of data. So in fact that we have some kinds of unfair treatment regarding about the non-availability of Scopus in Indonesian language. So we have some kinds of difficulties to express our mind and thinking opinions in English because English is not our native language. And the second one is regarding about your survey. As long as we have the so-called information audit, exactly the same as you talked about a data audit. So is it sometimes get a kind of confusion as to the term, as I told you, regarding about the what I call it, data audit, information audit, knowledge audit, and also other thing. But basically, I think they have a kind of some substantial similarities regarding about that activities. It's only a matter of term that we use. Do you think about that, Andrew?
Two really good questions. So I would agree with you. Essentially, the audit we've described is a specific type of information audit. And if you're, say, teaching students about information audits or knowledge audits, this is just a very specific example of one. So in that sense, I think there's a lot already in our library and information science curriculum that's highly relevant to doing research data management. It's maybe just a specific example that is very, very current now. So I think, I think we should be very confident if we're teaching library and information science that the fundamental stuff that we've talked about forever is still highly relevant. It applies to research data. Maybe there's some nuances, but it's really a very specific example of practices that we've been talking about for a long time. So I would definitely, I think that's what you're trying to say. So I definitely agree with you there. On the other question, and it's obviously quite controversial, but obviously the scholarly communication system advantages people like me who
Yes,
first language, people who have like their first language is English. I write in my own language. It's so much easier. Whereas if you're writing in another language, it's obviously a lot harder, but also there's things you can't express in another language. So there is a fundamental problem with the publishing system as it exists now. It's dominated by American and European companies who are trying to make loads of money out of research. I know in your country you've got a lot of open access journals that are run locally, but of course scholars are under pressure to publish in the international journals, the ones that get into scope. So it's a distorted system. So I think we have to acknowledge that this issue exists, and what can we do about it? Well, we can really try to say, things should be published in many languages. The range of things in Scopus should be widened. We should recognize there's different ways of doing research. Like there's a very strong movement in America and Australia for indigenous forms of epistemologies being given greater recognition, different ways of thinking. The domination of certain research traditions through the system is not really helpful. It's not promoting the plurality of knowledge that we really want. So that's where we go with that, I'm not sure, but it's irrelevant in the particular context of research data management. I think the point I'm trying to make is the things that you might do in the UK are not necessarily easily transferred to Indonesia because it's a different context. So we have to think about, maybe we have to rethink the whole idea. What is open science for a researcher in the UK? I don't think that it should necessarily mean the same in another country. I don't know, what do you want to say more about your opinions on that?
Yeah, I think that we had to start thinking about giving room for other language to be published and treated as international value, not only for English language, because that as long we know that we have the official language in United Nations like Arabic, English, Portuguese, something like that. And so we try to think about that to also to let other language, especially from Asian country, to be one of the international language recognized by international publisher and international community.
I wholeheartedly agree. So yeah, it's a really good point. And I think I think in the context of this what we're talking about today, I think it's like thinking about what is data for the researchers we deal with? What are the challenges they face? How do we help them? Acknowledging that the issues that I probably wrote about in my book, then may be different in a different context, and it wasn't really, it's really important that we recognize that.
Okay, right. That's the last questions.
Okay.
I think we can move.
Okay, so we just talk a little bit about research data policy. So a big thing that a lot of UK institutions did right at the beginning of thinking about research data management was to have a policy at an institutional level. And basically this was a way of the institution as a whole saying to researchers, well, research data is important, I'm going to define what research data is, and I'm going to say who are the stakeholders in this and what are their responsibilities. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I do think part of research data services is really having a policy in the background there that is agreed through discussing with many stakeholders and deciding what the institution's policies needs to be. You can find many examples that you might, in the UK, one institution tended to copy another because basically the principles are roughly the same in every context. But you can read many examples on this website. So something you might want to do later is think about, do we need a policy in my own institution? Would that be a useful thing? The point is that researchers will take it seriously if there's a policy there at an institutional level. But let's move on to the idea of research data services. So my question here is, what are research data? So what types of service might we be offering and who should deliver them? So we've got another poll now, and it's really interesting to hear what you think about. Again, we're going to force you a bit unrealistically to say what you think the most important policy service might be. So is it to help researchers write a data management plan, which is a kind of document that Armin did talk about? Data management plan is like a plan for how to manage data within a particular project. Is that the most important thing? They tend to be very important because funders often require them as part of an application. Is it really we should just have a website that explains why RDM is important? Is the key thing to have a data repository for your own institution? Or might it be a guide to finding data to reuse? So I've always thought a good way to get people to share their data is, first of all, get them to realize there's data out there that they could reuse themselves, and they realize the benefit to saving themselves a huge amount of time. Or do we just want a guide, a simple guide to where and how to share data? What do you think is the most important service? So, which do you think? We'll ask Harry to give us a bit of a summary.
Okay, 34% of the attendees answer the help for researchers to write data management plans to be the most needed research data service. I think, if I'm not mistaken, almost every university in the UK has provided librarian for this task. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah, because, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. Funders, people who are going to give you money to do research, often require a data management plan. And researchers aren't very used to doing that. They're not used to what goes into that. Is, writing about how much data I'm going to collect, where I'm going to store it, how I'm going to keep it secure, and those. So they come to writing this and they really struggle. So they often come for support around that. And actually, while it's not something maybe a librarian would be particularly familiar with, actually writing a data management plan is the thing that researchers tend to ask for first. So that is probably, a lot of people have voted for that as the key thing. I think that is a good answer. That probably is something that is really needed. But I think you can make a case for the other things too. For example, a website just explaining the issue, or a guide to where and how to share data. These things are needed too. We need to offer those kind of just informational support, really. And then a guide to finding data to reuse. I think that's also prompting people to start to think, we will tell people to do a literature review at the beginning of research, but we don't ask them to do a data review, a data search, but we probably should do. It should be as much about, okay, I'm going to read all the relevant literature. As much as that, we need to also encourage people to look for data that they could reuse. So that's really interesting to hear the results of the poll. This is from a survey we did, an international survey we did about 2 or 3 years ago. We won't go into the details, but really here's some of the services that were most widely developed in country like the UK and other global north countries. So it's promoting awareness of data, seemed to be the top thing. Offering, we had a question earlier about intellectual property rights, so actually advice on copyright, that was quite a high one. Training, instruction in data literacy and things like that, again, very common. Maintaining a website, pretty common. Data management planning. Offering advice on data citation and data publication. You can see there's a lot of advisory services. Down here in 10 is running a data repository. So that we could say that in the UK, there isn't really a national repository for all subjects as you've got, which is a real advantage for yourselves. Individual institutions run data repositories and stores, but this gives you a bit of a sense of the kind of things that people do, and you can see there's a big emphasis on advice and training and things like that. And right at the bottom, very rare, were things like advice on data analysis or support to do data analysis. That's pretty kind of rare phenomenon. So those are the kind of services that we're talking about when we talk about research data services. I think it's really important also, and I think this is a point that Armin also made, is that we're probably going to offer these services collaboratively. There's a big case for academic faculties and departments to offer these services themselves. And research administrators in the UK, we tend to have a department of the university that helps researchers gain funding and monitors what the funding requirements are. So that's what research administration is. Of course, IT also have a stake in research data services because there's a lot to do with where am I going to store my data? How do I make it secure if I want to share it with somebody? Those kind of things. So IT staff have a role. And also, I don't know how it's organized in Indonesia, but in the UK, there's quite often an archivist or university archivist or a records manager. They may be a small group of people, but they're rather important to kind of legal compliance issues. So again, I think this is something Armin talked about, that we're not just going to, as a library, say, offer this service. It's these research data services going to be collaborative. And because it's collaborative, I think what are the skills we need? We're going to move on to the skills we need to develop research data services. What skills do we need? I think we need to be good collaborators, good influencers, good managers, but it's all about collaboration in this area. It's not something probably libraries do on their own, for example, or information professionals do alone. They work with other people. It's all about, of course, we've got to work with researchers, but we've got to work with other services departments too. I'm going to stick very quickly through this slide. This just gives you a picture, a very quick picture of the kinds of different, the IT services might provide certain types of support, research administration might do certain things, and the library do others. It's a bit complicated, so I'm not going to go through that. You can maybe look at that afterwards and think about, for your own organization, who are the different people you want to collaborate with. But I'd like to pause again before we just move on to more or less the last topic about skills. Have anybody got any sort of questions that they'd like us to address at this point?
Okay, is there any question?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, yeah, there's none.
Okay, so what skills and knowledge and attitudes as well do we really need to operate in this area? Again, maybe ask you to type into the chat, and maybe Harry can read some of that. What do you think the skills or the knowledge base of someone working in RDM should be? What kind of, I say, attitudes, what kind of values, what kind of ways of working do you think are needed to work in this area? I think it'd be really interesting to hear what you're beginning to think is needed here. Is it about technical skill? Is it about knowledge of research and research processes? Is it core library skills, say creating metadata? What kind of helping people to search for stuff? What do you think the skills and knowledge and attitude would you think someone would need to be involved in RDM?
Okay, Rennie has answered the question, like curiosity, skills to be an accurate person, and then knows all types of data. And another one from Mr. Wardiono, the attitudes like open-minded is very necessary. And then skill is managerial and collaboration skill. And also communication skill.
Yeah.
Skill related to negotiation, managerial skills, and also communication skills from Vika. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think in those answers, there's a very strong emphasis on what I think sometimes called soft skills. You know, it's influencing people, communicating. And I do think that is actually the kind of skill you need. And to go back to earlier questions, like, is this something we're already in the LIS area good at? And the answer is, I think yes. I think we train information professionals to be good at these kind of things. And those kind of skills are quite generic. They're not very specific. Of course, there is things we do need to know, some more technical areas. It's good to know about metadata. But I do think the kind of soft transferable skills that we teach LIS people that they need in any context, whether they're working in a big organization, whether they're working in a university library, whether they're working in a small school library. These communication and persuasion skills are the key things you need to operate in RDM. So we should be confident that we're teaching people the right things. And I suppose, in this slide, I'm really talking about the kind of skills, the kind of things that we do in RDM. So at one end, we've got supporting people to do searches. That's very familiar. It's the kind of stuff librarians do all the time. The very end is the unfamiliar end of things like data analysis. Actually, most of the research data services we see delivered by libraries are more in the familiar end of things. It's really using familiar skills that we already have applied to a very specific context. It's helping people search. It's training people. It's thinking about data collection and managing a collection of data. So it's just a form of collection management. It's creating metadata. It's a particular form of metadata, but it's metadata. It's doing stuff like gathering requirements, it's building policies. So many of the things that are needed in our research data management are the application of skills that librarians already have, and we already train librarians to have. We did, in the survey that I mentioned before, ask various questions about where the skills gap were. These are some of the skills we asked about, and here's the kind of spider diagram indicating where at that time people said there was a skills gap. So again, I'm not going to go through that in great detail. Certainly there's, with research data, I think what's emerged from our discussion is like LIS skills are really relevant, and that many things like an information audit that we've always done, now we're applying it to research data. That requires a little bit more knowledge of some new technologies, a little bit more knowledge of particular ways of the different cultures of doing research, which maybe we wouldn't have known about before. New forms of intellectual property rights and ethics issues that perhaps we weren't exposed to before. But I think there's definitely a sense that we're building on what we already know. And I think to those of you kind of LIS educators, I think at the heart of this is maybe thinking about data literacy, and quite like Prado and Marzal's kind of definition of data literacy, and thinking about how do we build this into the curriculum will be a kind of key thing that we should be thinking about. It's like, because what I think we've seen in the last, say, 5 years is a shift. I think you're right, various questions have said, well, we talk about information, knowledge, data. We've always talked about those things, but there's been a shift of emphasis in society as a whole towards the language around data and to the importance of datafication. And because of that, we need to use that language of data a bit more. But when we talk about data literacy, I'm not sure it's much different from information literacy. But we've got to make a little bit of adjustment of language and emphasis, perhaps. And we've been talking about today about research data management, but actually what I'm also seeing a connection to is data management, data science, data governance in institutions. So you've got roles like the chief data officer, the data steward in big companies. It's not just the research data manager or the data librarian. It's also, these skills are applicable in the commercial sector, in every sector where data is being used increasingly. So I think in terms of promoting LIS as a subject, we can be positive that these skills taught for a long time, but applied to data are really, really relevant. So
we got a question from Rainy. Related to interdisciplinary backgrounds, what is your suggestion for today LIS students? Do they need to have specialized other education for a specific subject? I might need to explain more about the LIS in Indonesia. Most universities in Indonesia also taught LIS in undergraduate level.
Okay.
So it's a bit different with the UK.
Yeah, I think in the UK, I guess studying information tends to be a postgraduate thing. So people come from an undergraduate in history, in English, language, in any subject, in a science subject, and then they convert their skills to applying it to the management of information and library work. I think a broad background. So as the question, as Renee said in the question, kind of, I think, sort of an understanding of interdisciplinary ways of working, that broad understanding of how different disciplines do research. For working in this area, that's fantastic kind of background. But it's also, I think what's emerged from our discussion is, there was a question about culture, understanding different disciplinary cultures. So it's being the kind of person who can kind of find out about different ways of working. So I go into a big company, they've got a particular culture. I need to adjust my messages to that. I work in a university, it's a different culture. So the kind of person who understands basic principles of information, like creating metadata and standards and those things, but applies it in many different contexts. And it's also those soft skills of being a great collaborator, being someone who influences other people. These are the key skills I think we should be trying to promote through LIS programs and courses. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my thought.
Yes, another question from Dwi Untari. Could you please explain more about the services should be provided by the RDS team? Maybe you can go in details about the services should be provided by the RDS.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch part of that question.
Could you please explain more about the services that should be provided by the research data services in universities and other institutions?
Yeah, that's a good, I did rush over that now. So let me just quickly go backwards. So what does a research data service look like? So I think one thing you would be doing is probably training people such as PhD students. That would be a big function. Another big function would be having a website, developing a website that gave people guidance on why the issue is important, pointing them at key documents and things like that. A third service is probably data management planning. We've already discussed that a bit, but I think what is very typical of that is each researcher has a unique data management plan they've got to write. They need support, and they often need support at kind of short notice. So there's a kind of what should we say, advice service, a drop-in service, or people can send their draft data management plan, and someone will give them comments on a personalized level. In the UK, we would also probably be running a data repository, but it might be more about giving people support in kind of creating metadata to describe their data. So when I've deposited data, the library's always given me a lot of good feedback on improving the metadata I've associated with my stuff, and also guidance on that. There are other services that could be part of. So we talked about training, we talked about advice, we talked about a website. There's kind of advocacy work, going to different departments and explaining to them the importance of the topic. Then there's promoting the idea of looking for data. So just as I think people do a literature review, they need to be helped to navigate, to find data sources. In fact, that's a lot more challenging, I think, than actually searching for literature, because the tools for searching for literature are fantastic now, but for searching for data, that could be where you could really offer a great service that would have a big impact. So it's those kind of services. There are more obscure ones, so some institutions, particularly say in America, would probably have a service that helped people do data analysis, or picked data analysis tools like machine learning software. I think that's a bit less common in countries like the UK. But those are the kind of services that constitute research data services. So in many ways, I think you could see a very strong parallel between those things and services, say, libraries already provide. I hope that was a reasonable answer.
I want to ask you questions regarding to the RDM policy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in the university, primarily. About the top-down and bottom-up approach, what do you think the best in approaching RDM policy?
That's a really, really good question, yeah. So, in reality, I think mostly research data policies are developed top-down because they're essentially statements in a very broad level of responsibilities. They're saying, you know, the researcher must look after their data, the institution's going to provide these services. And this has got to be negotiated at a high level between, say, the heads of research, the head of the library, the head of IT. So those policies do tend to be quite top-down. And that's not the best way to develop. It shouldn't be without discussion, but I think those different stakeholders need to get together and come up with that high-level policy. Maybe the services can be built more from the bottom up. It's like, well, how do you turn that policy into actual services, into what training course I'm going to run? You've got to respond to demand at that level. How do I decide how to explain why research data is important, or research data management is important? I think that's, again, a more of a bottom-up thing. And then maybe over time, the policy evolves.
Yeah, a lot of homework for librarians to sharpen their advocacy skills, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so
yeah.
Just to kind of conclude, I just want to. There's some great resources out there. I think my book was mentioned at the beginning, but there are quite a lot of other books that are really, really good that are worth looking at, and some great websites. I think there's a couple of references there about this issue around like the decolonizing of scholarly data and so forth. I think what I'm going to suggest is we'll just like have a more open Q&A now, and let's just like see if there are any more questions before we just kind of have one little kind of wrap up, one kind of conclude activity. But I wonder if there's any.
Yeah, this is your opportunity to ask questions directly to Andrew, maybe through the Q&A tab, or you can type your questions on the chat box, or you can raise your hand. Okay. Mr. Fuad Ghani?
Ya, ini
okay.
Bu Moderator, sorry saya nanya karena sayang knowledge-nya kan kayak gitu untuk Andrew. Right. Okay, Andrew, you say that your approach in doing research is a qualitative research. That is a very complicated matter actually, because when we try to analyzing and interpreting data, we have a kinds of broad knowledge regarding of the context of data itself. So you have a kinds of strategy try to measure qualitative data so we can easy to analyze and interpreting at the same time.
Yeah, interesting question. Obviously, there are well-established methods such as critical thematic analysis, grounded theory, as approaches to analyzing qualitative data. Is that the kind of thing you mean? I mean, the whole point of qualitative data is that it doesn't have the same structure as, say, a survey, which, you know, you set up, perhaps design the questions to test hypotheses. It's very structured. It's not badly, whereas qualitative data is like you just go and ask some questions or you go and observe some people, and therefore the understanding you gain through that research just emerges from your kind of interaction with the data. It's a much more open-ended, unstructured process where ultimately, I think, for me, in qualitative research, you're trying to change how you think about a subject. So you've got some beliefs about what's important, but hopefully after you've collected and analysed the data, your understanding of that topic is completely different. So by definition, if that's the case, there can't be a clear structure. So you enter a sort of cloud of uncertainty where it's emotionally kind of quite challenging, that you're no longer sure what the question is. But hopefully you come out the other side and start to realise, okay, my way of thinking about this topic has changed. That's the power of qualitative data. I hope that answered your question, Peter.
Yeah, because right now we cannot approach in one approach, just only to approach by qualitative approach and also quantitative approach. We try to combine quantitative and qualitative approach at the same time to understand about the data that we have, and also try to give a kinds of solution regarding of the basic problem that we offer or try to thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, that in a mixed methods can kind of combine those two approaches, the qualitative, and then, yeah, having changed my idea through qualitative research of what the problem is or the issue is, a more quantitative approach can be quite useful after that in terms of achieving generalization. So, yeah, I agree. I tend to do more just qualitative research, but it's a good point.
Yeah, thank you.
Couple of questions from Mrs. Nosati. I'm wondering if the RDM should be included formally into the LS curriculum for undergraduate degree. If yes, then could you please mention some examples of courses that might lead to RDM?
Yeah, the first question, I think I'll go back to arguing, as we've discussed, a lot of the principles of RDM are basically things we've done in other areas, but a very specific application of it. I do think RDM, I'm not sure whether RDM needs to be in the curriculum, but I do think data management and datafication, data studies are increasingly something you can't really avoid. Not that you want to avoid them, but I think even for, say, someone who's trained to be a librarian, understanding data is really important, because increasingly decisions are made using data, and you have to manage data. So actually, yeah, I think data needs to be part of the curriculum. I think data literacy needs to be in there. And I actually I've just done this report on artificial intelligence, which is kind of maybe the next step beyond big data, is like to talk artificial intelligence. So I think artificial intelligence also needs to be in the LIS curriculum at sub-level. Mention examples of courses that might lead to RDM. I don't want to particularly list, I mean, we in our department, we teach data science, we teach librarianship, we teach knowledge and information management. I guess that's pretty typical of many institutions. So looking around at different curriculums is probably a good idea to see how they handle it in different countries.
Yes, in librarianship course, we got the RDM included in archive and record management.
Okay.
Yes, in Sheffield University. Yeah. Okay. Now the question coming from Mrs. Rohani Rahayu. Actually, how much time needed by researchers to accept the concept of the RDM?
Yeah, that's another good question. So yeah, we've said it's a kind of cultural challenge. We're changing organizational culture, changing disciplinary culture. I think some researchers already know more than we know. That's good because they can be advocates for the issue. So at Sheffield, a psychologist is the RDM champion for the whole institution. So it's always good to use people from academic disciplines who are kind of really ahead on things as kind of leaders. At the same time, there's other disciplines where they're a long way from really understanding what RDM is about and may believe it's completely irrelevant, particularly maybe in humanities areas where they just don't talk about data. So there, we probably need to do a lot more work. So if you're, say, a librarian, as a liaison librarian working with particular departments, you've got to work out which level of maturity or which level of connection your researchers you're dealing with have, and then adjust your plans to that. This is what makes, I think, the topic interesting, because it's quite complicated and it could be very different if you're working with health sciences from if you're working with historians or geographers. It's just so different.
Is there any other questions?
So one thing I was going to suggest that we do before we finish is like maybe spend a few moments for yourself thinking about, what am I going to do next? 3 main things you plan to do next about this. We're all very individual. I'm not going to ask you to kind of share them, but it might be going and reading a book. It might be going and talking to a researcher about their data. It might be looking at a curriculum in another institution about how they talk about research data, where it fits into their curriculum. But I think it's always useful at the end of one of these sessions is to like think for yourself about 2 or 3 things you want to do next. So I think taking a bit of a pause, just let you write something down for yourself. We go on these courses and then sometimes we just forget afterwards. It's really good at this moment to like just write a note to yourself. What do you want to do to follow up on what you've found out today?
Okay, from Reni, speak with researchers, build RDM skills, and collaborate.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Oh, someone's going to build a RDM website. That's impressive. There are many examples out there. I'm not saying copy exactly what other people have got, but I think you can find great examples that you can kind of emulate. I think for everybody, it might be something a little bit different about what you're going to do. But I do recommend, like, just invite a PhD researcher for a cup of coffee, talk to them about their research and find out about what data means to them. That can be a really good starting point because it overcomes that feeling of, I'm not really sure what research data is exactly. But talking about a specific case, it always is kind of a very pleasant experience, I find.
You want to recap now?
Let me just, okay, so yeah, I just wanted to, a resource I just saw recently was this from Liber. It's like 6 tips to engage researchers. That's quite a nice little idea of something to read. It's short, it's easy to understand, and it might be a good starting point for what to do next. But my main point is thanks for participating in this session. I hope you found it of some interest, and thanks for all the questions. They're really, really good questions. Some very philosophical. I hope they need a lot more discussion. Some quite political and some very practical. So I hope you've enjoyed the session, and I think my email is on the slide somewhere. You're very welcome to kind of contact me if you want to ask any other questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I would like to recap some of your presentation. Okay, Andrew has talked a lot about definition of research data and then characteristic of data, the drivers of RDM, and the development of open science, and also the challenges in managing and sharing the data. And then Andrew has talked also about research data policy and research data services in institution. So we finally reached the end of the presentation or the webinar. Andrew, could you please give us like closing statement for this webinar?
Yeah, I think I suppose my closing statement is this is a very interesting area of work. It draws on LIS skills. We can make a really good contribution in this area, whether you're a librarian or you're a lecturer in LIS, or we can make a great contribution here in helping our researchers to promote their research better, to sharing data. So I'll just go back to this idea of like, go and talk to researchers, go and chat to them, find out what their issues are, and good luck. And I hope I think it's a very positive that you're having this series of webinars. It's really a good opportunity to learn about this topic.
Okay, it's quite new concept in Indonesia for the RDM. Thank you so much, Andrew, for making time to be the presenter here. And thank you everyone for your active participation and making time in attending this webinar. And make sure you follow the social media account of PDD ILIPI. We'll be having other interesting webinars in the near future. And thank you once again, Andrew, and all the attendees. And we can go back to Rennie. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Ms. Ari, for helping us moderating this session. It is very much appreciated. And actually, we have a second polls that you can see on the screen now.
Yeah, we have second polls.
The last one, we really we're really concerned about the RDM skills that we need to have as a librarian and information professional. That's why we made this webinar, RDM webinar series. So I hope you get many information, new informations and knowledge and insights about this topic. And based on this questions in the polls, I hope you can also answer this. And if you consider providing research data services in your institutions, if you're working in the university or the research institutions, it will be very beneficial for researchers to have these facilities. And also, you also can participate in our RDM webinar series. It will be conducted in the few months, and it will be there will be many speakers related and experts related this RDM. So from the polling, yeah, Miss Ari, can you help me to summarize?
Do you know more about RDM from today's event? Okay, 92% said yes. Okay. We thank you for the PDD-LIPI because we learn more about the RDM. And the second question, will you consider providing research data services in your institution if available? 71% said yes. Okay, maybe you could use screen that provided by PDD-LIPI. And 29% said maybe. No one said no. And the third result, will you consider using research data services in your institution if available? 75% said yes and 25% said maybe. The fourth question, will you participate in other RDM webinar series in the future? 83% said yes, 17% said maybe. Okay, this is a very good result.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ms. Ari, for summarizing the poll result. And thank you, Andrew, for your knowledge sharing and your time. Thank you also to the audience for your wonderful participation. A huge appreciation to PDD-LIPI, Mr. Hendro Subagio, for your support in realizing the webinar. Also, gratitude goes to the organizing committee for your relentless effort for this webinar. Mr. Cahyo, Rizal, Untari, Rulina, Dina, Natalia, and of course, Ms. Ari as our moderator today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, so you can access the recording of the webinar on your YouTube, on the YouTube at Kepustakaan PDD-LIPI. Then the presented materials can be accessed on the link put on the chat. Thank you, and I finally and officially close this third webinar series. Good afternoon, stay safe and healthy. See you on our next RDM webinar series. Bye.
Bye, see you. Thank you.
Yang di Indonesia saat ini masih dilakukan secara terpisah di masing-masing institusi dan dilakukan oleh peneliti secara individual sehingga cukup sulit bagi pemangku kepentingan di bidang riset untuk melihat sejauh mana perkembangan kegiatan riset berdasarkan data penelitian yang dimiliki dalam skala nasional. Terlebih lagi, repositori institusi sebagai wadah penyimpanan aset pengetahuan saat ini baru dimanfaatkan sebatas menyimpan karya atau publikasi ilmiah. Di negara maju yang telah berkembang kegiatan risetnya, negara memiliki tanggung jawab dalam melakukan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui repositori nasional, seperti Australia dengan ANS, Inggris dengan UK Data Service, serta Belanda dengan DANS. Pengelolaan data penelitian dengan menyimpan pada media tertentu seperti komputer, laptop, atau eksternal hard disk kurang dapat diandalkan dan beresiko untuk rusak. Selain itu, Ada risiko lain yang tak kalah berbahaya, yakni hilangnya media karena pencurian. Di mana hal ini sangatlah disayangkan, mengingat data tersebut adalah hasil kerja keras selama bertahun-tahun. Oleh karena itu, penyimpanan pada repositori institusi menjadi solusi yang paling ideal. Perilaku peneliti dalam melakukan penyimpanan data penelitian sangat bervariasi. Dalam kajian yang dilakukan oleh tim PDII LIPI, bahwa selama ini peneliti melakukan penyimpanan paling banyak pada media laptop atau personal komputer dan berbagai penyimpanan eksternal. Kondisi ini diperparah dengan backup data yang dilakukan semaunya. Dalam melakukan penelitian, seorang peneliti idealnya sudah memiliki satu perencanaan manajemen data. Banyak sekali manfaat yang akan diperoleh peneliti, institusi, maupun negara ketika bisa menerapkan manajemen data penelitian dengan ideal, yakni efisiensi. Ketersediaan data pada repositori nasional akan mengurangi kegiatan penelitian yang serupa. Safety. Berbagai risiko kehilangan data yang disebabkan oleh perangkat penyimpanan dapat diminimalisir dan juga merupakan upaya untuk melindungi hak kekayaan intelektual. Quality. Repositori akan membantu peneliti untuk menjaga kualitas data dan proses kurasi memungkinkan data penelitian terpelihara sehingga dapat digunakan kembali. Reputation. Seorang peneliti akan meningkat reputasinya saat datanya digunakan kembali oleh peneliti lainnya. Compliance. Kewajiban menyimpan data yang ditetapkan penyandang dana penelitian dapat diakomodir melalui repositori institusi. Pentingnya mendepositkan dan membagikan data jika dilakukan oleh peneliti terbagi menjadi 3 keuntungan. Bagi peneliti, dapat meningkatkan reputasi dan visibilitas penelitian individu. Bagi komunitas ilmiah, dapat meningkatkan kolaborasi. Dan bagi masyarakat, mereka akan mendapatkan akses yang lebih mudah ke dunia penelitian. LIPI, melalui Pusat Data dan Dokumentasi Ilmiah atau PDDI, menginisiasi kegiatan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui sistem penyimpanan data penelitian dengan nama Repositori Ilmiah Nasional atau disingkat RIN. Dengan kapasitas yang tak terbatas, RIN mampu menyimpan dan berbagi data penelitian seluruh peneliti. RIN mampu berkontribusi dalam pemetaan perkembangan dunia penelitian. RIN, kunci kemajuan iptek Indonesia.